Hello, my name is Assad Khalilzadeh. Welcome to Insight City, an interview show produced by the students of San Diego City College. Each week, we are talking to the newsmakers of our campus. The college requires everyone to wear a mask indoors, and that includes all of our crew here in our studio. We have an exemption for those of us who are on camera for the duration of the show. Today's guest is Jakob McWhinney, a multimedia journalist who is the host of the Listening Machine podcast. But first, Joel Garcia will start us off with a quick look at the producer behind the podcast.
At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Jakob McWhinney lost both of his jobs within a week. So the 31-year-old musician decided to go back to school at San Diego City College. 18 months after the pandemic took something from him, McWhinney is giving others a voice in a new podcast. It's called The Listening Machine, and it gives callers a simple way to share their frank feelings.
The point of this project is to allow our neighbors to speak for themselves in an unfiltered and honest way about the issues that affect them, and to take some time to actually listen.
McWhinney highlights the stories of callers whose lives have changed due to the pandemic in the podcast's debut episode.
And I'm so glad this experience is almost over and we can all go back to the maybe lives we had before that with probably some slight modifications.
It's been a couple of months since Dave left this voicemail, which coincidentally means it's also been a couple of months since I've eaten a grilled cheese sandwich.
McWhinney says his background as a musician helps him as a podcast producer. He has performed at rock bands over the last decade, like The Soaks, Spooky Cigarettes, and New Me. McWhinney is usually playing the guitar or bass for these bands with eclectic degrees of rock. The pandemic may have taken away McWhinney's jobs, but it has given him a second chance with the Listening Machine. Find it on sdcitytimes.com/citytimesound. For Inside City, I'm Joel Garcia.
Jacob, just quickly, I guess tell us about what the Listening Machine is, and also, did you have an intended audience when you first started the podcast?
The Listening Machine is a modern call-in show of sorts. I kind of like to imagine that it's somewhere between like an AM radio show and some more NPR-focused kind of Radio Lab or This American Life sort of show. We try to take the voices of people in our city and elevate them via the use of scoring and contextual information and other sort of modern audio editing techniques. I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Well, the second part of the question was there an intended audience when you first started?
Yes, there was an intended audience when I first started, and it was a pretty broad one. The idea for this podcast was to try and create something that allowed for really all San Diegans to take part in, and a platform where they can have their voices heard, especially about some of the issues that are some of the most consequential in our city, like COVID and homelessness and stuff like that.
And do you feel that you've hit your intended audience, or do you or how do you think it's been going so far?
I think it's been going well. I think that it's really only, I'll be able to figure that out once the episodes really start coming out. But that being said, I really hope, COVID-19 was a very clear topic that affected everyone in very clear ways and very profound ways. At the same time, those effects were extremely varied. And I hope with new kind of themes that we'll be exploring throughout the podcast, that we'll be able to bring more people into the conversation. So these first 3 episodes, this first season, focused, like I said, on the COVID-19 pandemic and San Diegans' experiences during that time. But in the next season, we'll be focusing on homelessness in San Diego and the effect that it's had on people who've experienced homelessness, people who have been affected by that housing shortage and the housing price crisis, and those who feel they have thoughts and ideas to help alleviate the issue. So, which with each new season, with each new theme, we hope that we can bring more San Diegans into the conversation and give them ways to have their voices heard.
You're getting these very personal stories and experiences from people. I guess, was that a very difficult thing to try and do at the beginning?
Definitely. I'm new to journalism, and so asking people to call up a voicemail and leave a couple minutes of some of their deepest feelings and fears and worries, that's a really tough thing. It's a really tough sell for people. And there have been a couple calls where people express trepidation about the whole thing. I had one woman who called in and was, despite the fact that she left a very heartfelt message, she was very concerned that it was potentially a scam, which, given our current epidemic of spam and scam phone calls, I don't blame her. But yeah, it was tough. And it was tough to try and take those really deep and profound, worries and experiences and present them in a way that was not only sensitive, but allowed for kind of further exploration of their concerns.
Do you feel that it being on voicemail to where people couldn't, show their face and maybe they didn't want to share their name, it was easier for them to share these experiences?
Yeah, definitely. I think that a certain level of anonymity certainly helps with honesty in this particular field. That being said, I wanted to focus on having voicemails left because we have a very, social media has allowed everybody to post their thoughts 24 hours a day. And it's created these social media platforms that in large part are these kinds of battlegrounds between opposing viewpoints. And I feel like people's voices, when they actually speak something, it is, first off, just a very cathartic experience to be able to say something. Once you say it, it doesn't live solely in your head. It has a place in the real world. And all of a sudden it's actualized in a way that doesn't happen when you just type something out or write something out. So yes, it did help with anonymity, but at the same time, I feel like speaking things, hearing somebody actually say something is a much more emotional and relevant experience than reading, personally.
I guess what made you interested in starting a podcast, and I guess why did you end up starting it?
This is kind of my first foray into podcasts. It wasn't something that I really even imagined doing. I'm a huge podcast listener, but it just wasn't really something that I imagined myself doing. But last semester, I was enrolled in DJRN 200, and I decided to take the honors course for it. And one of the options for the honors project was to create a podcast. And being given that opportunity to sort of try it out was great. It allowed me to take a leap into that world while still knowing that if I made something kind of crappy, it didn't have to come out to everywhere. It could just be an assignment if I wanted it to be, and it could be something more if I wanted it to be. And so that allowed me to really take a big dive into it. And it gave me time to sort of conceptualize it, and professors Vargas and Acedo really allowed me to bounce ideas off of them and to kind of refine the idea from what was a very nebulous and kind of abstract concept to something more focused and thematic and, in my opinion, engaging.
Mm-hmm. We had a chance to listen to a small piece of your podcast, and you mentioned earlier the modern technology with audio effects and stuff like that. The quality of your podcast and audio-wise is so very good. What do you think that comes from? We spoke earlier about you having a music background. Do you think it comes from there?
I think in large part, yeah. I have a long history in music. I've played music. I still play music. I've been playing for over a decade in bands and recording, and so through that I've developed. I've always been a stickler. It's always been really tough for me to put something out into the world because I can always find something to mess around with at the last second. And so having years to kind of understand some of the basic dynamics of audio editing and audio engineering really gave me a pretty good foundation to take a step into podcasting. And in addition to that, my background playing music gave me allowed me to write a lot of the music that you hear in the podcast. Not all of it is original, but the vast majority is. And being able to integrate some of those skills from, my life before pursuing journalism at City made the experience all the more enjoyable, and really allowed me to kind of create something that I was very proud of and that encapsulated multiple different aspects of myself.
And you spoke earlier how the first season covered mostly COVID stories. COVID affected all of our lives very differently and took us in directions that we didn't really think we were going. How did COVID affect you, and was it a contributing factor to you starting your podcast?
It definitely was a contributing factor. COVID affected me in a whole variety of ways. Prior to COVID, I was working two jobs, playing gigs every other weekend, and then COVID hit, and within a weekend I'd lost both of my jobs, and for a couple months I just was feeling really lost. It became unfeasible to play music live, and rehearsals became really tough to get together simply because there was so many unknowns, and it felt very unsafe at the time. And through that experience, after a couple months of just real confusion, I decided to finally go back to school. It was something that I'd always meant to do. But COVID gave me a really, really perfect opportunity to do that. And I feel very, very lucky, very blessed to have been given that opportunity to take a step away from a life of just kind of hustle and grind to something a little more aspirational. And it's felt really good to get back into schooling and to start to flex some of these new skills and learn new things. And so, yeah, this podcast absolutely would not exist had it not been for COVID.
Well, as we see the pandemic, I guess, waning and coming to a close, where do you see the listening machine evolving?
So the first season of COVID stuff is hopefully just the beginning. I'm currently working on the last episode of that first season, which will focus exclusively on vaccines. So if you have experiences with vaccines, if you've gotten it, if you haven't gotten it, please leave a message at 619-736-8976 or visit thelisteningmachine.com. Additionally, I hope for the next season to focus on homelessness in San Diego. It's an issue that affects all of us in one way or another, and it affects some of us in much more profound ways. And it's an issue that's just unsustainable, and one that we need to start figuring out new creative solutions to. And I believe that people in San Diego really have a lot of thoughts that they don't necessarily get to express. And so I hope to be able to hear from those experiencing homelessness, those who work to help alleviate it, those who just wake up every day and witness it in our city streets. And after this next season, I'm open to suggestions. I want to be able to remain kind of nimble and work with themes that are currently locally relevant. But if you have any ideas, please reach out at thelisteningmachine.com.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. We appreciate your time so much. Once again, if anybody wants to listen to your podcast, they can. The Listening Machine. The Listening Machine is the debut podcast for City Times Sound for the fall season. You can catch the first episode today on sdcitytimes.com/citytimessound. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside City. That's all we have for tonight. I'm Assad Khalilzadeh. Thank you and good night.